The mail-order bride rejected for having a child until a lonely rich cowboy took her into his heart. Under the sweltering midday sun of Dusty Creek, the train let out a long, piercing whistle before hissing to a halt. Steam hissed from its sides, mixing with dust rising from the dry ground as people bustled about the platform. Among them stood Hannah Whitmore, 28 years old, her shoulders straight though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. In her left hand she gripped a worn leather suitcase, and with her right she held onto the small hand of her daughter Emily, who clung to her side in a tattered blue dress and sun hat too large for her little head. Hannah's heart pounded. The letter she clutched inside her coat pocket had promised hope, a second chance, a man named Thomas who wanted a good woman to help him build a home. She had written honestly, except for one omission. One she had feared might cost her everything. She had not told him about Emily. From across the platform, a tall man and a woman in a green velvet dress approached. The woman's chin lifted high, her expression already sour. Thomas, younger than Hannah expected, clean-shaven with stiff posture, looked past her as if inspecting a stranger. "Are you Hannah Whitmore?" the woman demanded, her voice cutting through the air. "Yes," Hannah replied, steadying her voice. "And this is— who is that child?" Thomas interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Hannah took a breath. "Her name is Emily. She's my daughter." Silence fell over the immediate area. The woman's nostrils flared. "You have a child?" She spat the word like poison. I thought it best to wait until we met to explain," Hannah said, her voice softening. "I was afraid I would never get a reply if I— "You lied," Thomas snapped, his face flushed. "You misled us." "I didn't lie. I did not tell you everything. Please understand. I am not looking for charity. I work hard. I am honest." The woman turned away with a scoff, clutching her son's arm. "We are not running an orphanage, Thomas." "Mother's right," Thomas said, his tone final. "You should not have come." "But we wrote letters for months," Hannah whispered, her throat tight. "You said you wanted someone sincere." "I wanted a wife," Thomas said coldly, "not baggage." The words struck like a slap. Hannah's grip on Emily's hand tightened. Her daughter looked up, confused and frightened. The two turned and walked away without another word. The platform slowly resumed its noise, but for Hannah the world seemed to have stopped. She stood frozen, exposed and humiliated beneath the glaring sun. Emily's bottom lip trembled. "It's okay, sweetheart," Hannah murmured, kneeling to Emily's level. "We still have each other." Emily dropped her handkerchief as she wrapped her arms around her mother. Before Hannah could reach for it, a shadow fell over them. A man bent down, picked up the tiny square of fabric, and gently brushed the dust from it. He was tall, lean, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over sun-worn features, and a weathered coat that smelled faintly of horse and smoke. He said nothing at first, just looked at the child, then up at Hannah with quiet intensity. He handed the handkerchief to Emily with a nod, then said in a deep, low voice, "Children are never at fault." His words were simple, but they struck Hannah like a warm breeze after a long winter. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, but he had already turned and walked away toward a chestnut horse tied to a post nearby. Without a backward glance he mounted and rode off, swallowed by the dusty road. Hannah held the handkerchief against her chest, blinking back tears. For the first time that day, someone had looked at her without judgment. She did not know who he was, or why his words had pierced so deep. But in that moment, when everything else had been taken from her, those 6 words became a lifeline. She stood, lifted Emily into her arms, and whispered, "We'll be all right, my love. Somehow we will." Philadelphia had never been kind to Hannah Whitmore. Its narrow, soot-streaked streets and echoing alleyways bore witness to her quiet suffering. 3 winters ago, James, her husband, her first love, walked out of their 2-room flat without a word. Emily was barely a year old. The day he left, the coal stove had gone cold, and so had the spot beside her in bed. His boots never returned, and neither did his promises. At first, She waited. Then she begged. Letters sent to relatives, inquiries through neighbors, even visits to the factory where he once worked. Nothing. One afternoon, Mrs. Callahan from next door gave her a look of pity and murmured, "You're better off without him, dear." But Hannah wasn't so sure. Left with a child and no income, she had turned to her last remaining thread, her hands. Her mother, long gone, had taught her to sew, and with needle and thread she began patching clothes for neighbors, taking in mending, altering wedding dresses for girls she had grown up with. During the day, Emily would toddle about the cramped living space, babbling happily with buttons and scraps. But at night, when the child finally slept, Hannah worked by candlelight. Bent over fabric until her fingers bled, she stitched not just thread, but desperation and love into every hem. She lived in a room above her in-laws' boarding house, tolerated more than accepted. James's mother never passed up a chance to remind her she was a burden. "He left because you were too soft," the woman sneered once, her mouth twisted. "Men need strong wives, not broken girls with mouths full of poetry." Eventually, Hannah was told to leave. No warning, just the slam of a door and a week to find shelter. She found it in a basement apartment with peeling walls and a leaky ceiling. It was cold in winter, damp in spring, but it was hers. There, with Emily asleep beside her in a drawer lined with blankets, her makeshift crib, Hannah began to dream of something better. The idea came from a newspaper discarded in the alley. A thin folded ad section. Seeking modest, hard-working women for companionship and marriage. Westward expansion offers honest beginnings. She read it over and over. At first she laughed. Then she cried. And finally she wrote. Her letters were careful, honest in tone, sincere in spirit, but she could not bring herself to mention Emily. She knew what the answer would be if she did. She justified it with every line she wrote. She was a good woman. She would make a good wife. Her daughter was not a stain, but a star in her sky. Still, she folded that part of herself away and sealed the envelope without it. To Thomas Ellery of Dusty Creek, Montana, she became simply Hannah Whitmore, woman of quiet strength, willing to travel west and start anew. She mailed the letter on a Tuesday, hands trembling as she dropped it into the box. Days passed, then weeks, and then he wrote back. His first letter was short, formal, but not unkind. His second longer. Over the course of 2 months, they exchanged 10 letters. He wrote about the land, about horses and winter storms, and the loneliness of a man with no wife. He asked if she could cook. She said yes. He asked if she believed in God. She said she did. And somewhere between the lines, she dared to believe in possibility again. Yet every time she folded his letter, she folded guilt into it. Emily, her daughter with laughter like chimes and eyes like twilight. She told herself she would reveal the truth when the time came, when he saw her, when he could understand. Late one night, after putting Emily to sleep with a song only half sung, Hannah sat at her wooden table beneath a guttering candle and wrote her final letter. She accepted his proposal. She agreed to come. She would be on the train in 2 weeks' time. She read the letter 5 times before folding it. Her fingers hovered above Emily's name. She closed her eyes and sealed the envelope. The next morning, with only her sewing kit, 3 dresses, and a child wrapped in a wool blanket, she packed a bag. Her landlord gave her a curt nod. Mrs. Callahan offered her a crust of bread and a whispered prayer. No one else came to see her off. But Hannah walked to the station with her head held high, the letter in her coat pocket, and a fragile hope blooming in her chest. She was not just leaving Philadelphia. She was walking toward a future where someone perhaps would see her not as damaged goods, but as a woman worth loving. The bell above the Dusty Creek diner's door jingled softly as Hannah stepped inside, Emily's small hand clasped in hers. The afternoon sun outside was unforgiving, but inside the diner was cool and dim. The scent of baked beans and fried potatoes hung in the air. A few townsfolk glanced up and quickly looked away. The murmur of conversation quieted, replaced by that heavy silence Hannah had grown used to, one that judged without words. She led Emily to a booth in the far corner. The wooden bench creaked under their weight. Hannah smoothed her skirt and wrapped an arm around her daughter. Emily smiled, her cheeks pink from the sun, trusting her mother completely, despite the gnawing hunger in her belly. A waitress with a stern face and hair pulled tight approached. "Something to eat?" she asked, eyeing Hannah's threadbare clothes. "Just a bowl of soup, please, and some water," Hannah said gently. "That all?" "If I could have a slice of bread for my daughter," Hannah hesitated. "I'm short this week, but I'll be cleaning houses. I can pay tomorrow." The woman crossed her arms. "We're not a charity, miss." Before Hannah could answer, a chair scraped across the floor. A man stood from a table near the back, tall, lean, wearing a brown duster and wide-brimmed hat. His presence carried weight, and when he walked to the counter, silence followed him. Without a word, he handed a few coins to the waitress and turned toward the door. "What's this for?" she asked, confused. He paused, tipped his hat toward Hannah. "Her meal. And the child's, too." Hannah looked up in shock, meeting his gaze, dark, quiet, familiar. It was the same man who had picked up Emily's handkerchief at the train station, the only soul who had spoken kindness to her in days. She opened her mouth to thank him, but no sound came out. He held her gaze for a second longer, steady, understanding, then turned and walked out, spurs clicking softly across the floorboards. No introduction, just a quiet act. The waitress blinked, then cleared her throat and set a bowl of soup and a slice of bread on their table. The tone of her posture slightly softened. As Emily dipped her bread into the soup and giggled at the rising steam, Hannah sat in stunned silence. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from something else. Gratitude. Grace. A flicker of dignity she had nearly forgotten. After they finished eating, Hannah noticed a small cloth bag on the bench beside her. It hadn't been there before. Inside were 3 fresh rolls, a wedge of cheese wrapped in wax paper, and a folded note in careful, masculine handwriting. "There's no shame in hunger. There's only shame in turning away from it." The tears came before she could stop them. Quiet, stinging tears that rolled down her cheeks. She turned her face away, embarrassed, but they kept coming. It was the first time she had cried since stepping off the train. Emily leaned into her. "Mama?" Hannah kissed her daughter's forehead. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I believe we will." Outside, Luke Walker stood beside his horse, watching through the diner window. He saw the woman weeping quietly and the child smiling beside her. He did not move. He had not meant to stop today. He rarely came to town anymore. Since Mary's death, his world had grown small, silent, and his ranch had become more of a refuge than a home. But something about the woman's eyes, haunted but proud, had struck something inside him. The way she held her daughter, the way she carried herself in the face of cruelty. He had seen that look before, in the mirror. And now, watching her behind the glass, he realized something. He didn't feel quite as empty as he had before. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the hills, dust curling in his wake. Inside, Hannah folded the note gently and slipped it into her pocket like a prayer. She didn't know his name, but she knew his kindness, and that, somehow, had changed everything. The church sat on the edge of Dusty Creek, its white paint peeling in strips, the steeple leaning slightly like an old man with a crooked back. Father Grant, with his kind eyes and beard as white as cotton, opened the creaking door when Hannah knocked. Her voice trembled as she explained her situation, but he listened patiently, nodding slowly, a worn Bible tucked under one arm. "I have no family," she said, holding Emily close. "No place to go." Father Grant led them to the back of the church, where an old stable stood. "It is not much," he said, glancing apologetically at the dusty floor and loose boards, "but it will keep the rain off your heads, and I can offer food if you are willing to work." "I am," Hannah said quickly. "Anything." She swept the floors of the chapel each morning, her skirts dragging through the dust. She cleaned the pews, polished the altar, and tended to the tiny vegetable garden behind the church. When Father Grant mentioned that some of the local children could not read, she offered to teach them. At first, only one or two came, shy, barefoot children with runny noses and curious eyes. But soon others followed. Hannah used charcoal and paper scraps to teach letters, drawing them in the dirt when they had nothing else. Her voice was soft but sure, and when she read aloud, even the most restless children fell silent. Emily sat beside her mother during lessons, repeating each word with pride. The townsfolk remained distant. At the general store, people stepped aside rather than speak to her. Whispers followed her from aisle to aisle. "That's the mail-order bride with the bastard child," they muttered. "She was rejected and still stayed." Faces turned cold when she entered the bakery or passed the saloon, but she kept her chin up and her eyes ahead. Each night, in the stable, turned home, Hannah washed Emily's hair with rainwater and wrapped her in a wool shawl. They shared one blanket, and Hannah stayed awake long after Emily slept, stitching torn seams by lantern light. Sometimes she would hum lullabies from her childhood, the soft notes echoing off the wooden beams. One morning, after a week of hard frost, Father Grant found her in the garden, trying to coax life from frozen soil. He watched her for a moment, then asked, "Why do you stay, Hannah?" She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because if I leave, what lesson do I teach my daughter? That we run when we are unwanted?" Father Grant's eyes softened. He said nothing more, only placed a loaf of bread in her hands and turned back toward the church. The days passed slowly, but purpose bloomed quietly within her. The children she taught smiled when they saw her. One gave her a daisy, another a wooden button. Small things, but they filled her heart. Even when a woman in town refused to accept her coin, tossing it back with a sneer, Hannah reminded herself she had survived worse. Emily remained untouched by the weight of it all. She ran barefoot through the churchyard, sang to the chickens, and brought her mother dandelions with solemn ceremony. Her laughter filled the empty chapel like sunlight, and though Hannah still felt small in this town, she began to see herself through different eyes, not the ones that judged, but the ones of the children who listened to her stories, the old priest who handed her bread, and the little girl who trusted her completely. She was no longer just surviving, she was becoming. Walker Ranch stretched wide across the western hills, its fences threading through golden prairie under the morning sun. Luke Walker stood by the corral, arms crossed, watching the horizon with that distant look he wore so often. A man who had once loved and lost. His silence had become his refuge. It had been 3 weeks since he saw Hannah at the diner, her eyes heavy with quiet sorrow. He hadn't spoken to her, but he hadn't stayed away either. Every Sunday before sunrise, he left small bundles at the church, flour, apples, a pair of boots for a little girl, even cough syrup as the nights turned cold. Once he left wildflowers bound in twine beside the garden. He never left a name, and Father Grant never asked. Eventually Luke realized she needed more than kindness, she needed purpose. The ranch needed tending. The main house was dusty and dim. He told his foreman to offer her work. When Hannah arrived, she wore the same faded dress, hair tucked under a scarf, posture braced for rejection. "I was told you need help?" she asked quietly. "Luke Walker says you're to clean the house, 2 days a week, $2 a day," the foreman replied. $2? Her voice held disbelief. Boss's orders. She took the job. She scrubbed, dusted, and polished the windows until light poured through. She never complained. The ranch hands noticed. Emily sometimes sat on the porch, humming, her little feet swinging as her mother worked nearby. One afternoon, while tidying the study, Hannah found a handkerchief on a stack of books, pale blue linen, edges soft with use. Her breath caught. The silver thread, a tiny star stitched in the corner. It was the same one Luke had given Emily. She sat, the cloth trembling in her hands. It had been him all along. Luke Walker, the man who had offered no words but so much grace. She left the house and stepped into the old stable, where her cleaning rags were kept. Alone, Surrounded by the scent of hay and leather, she sat on a stool and pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and uncontrollable. She whispered, "I know it was you." Outside, Luke stood beside his horse, watching the stable door. He hadn't meant for her to know, not yet. He feared she might think it pity, but watching her now, her vulnerability wrapped in strength, stirred something long dormant in him. She reminded him of Mary, not in looks, but in spirit. That quiet fight to stay upright in a world that kept trying to break her. He turned back toward the house, saying nothing. He wouldn't speak of it, not yet. But he would keep helping, not for thanks, because he understood, and because, without meaning to, he had started to believe in something again. Rain slammed against the roof of the stable like 1,000 fists. Wind howled through the trees, bending them like twigs, and thunder cracked the sky wide open. Hannah sat beside the cot where Emily lay, her small body burning with fever, cheeks flushed red, breath shallow and fast. The fire in the corner flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Hannah wrung out a damp cloth and placed it on Emily's forehead, her hands shaking. "Please," she whispered, pressing her lips to her daughter's temple. "Please stay with me." Earlier that day, Emily had seemed fine, quiet perhaps, a little tired, but smiling, as always. By sundown, her fever had surged. Hannah had run to the apothecary, but the door was locked. She banged and pleaded, but the man inside refused to open. "We don't treat beggars or bastards," he muttered through the shut. She went to 2 homes, then 3. Doors slammed in her face. No one wanted to be seen helping the mail-order bride who had been left at the altar. Now Emily lay still. Too still. Hannah clutched her daughter's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't leave me, baby," she said. "I don't know how to be in this world without you." Lightning flashed outside, followed by another violent crack of thunder, and then the door burst open. Luke Walker stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He didn't say a word. Hannah looked up, startled. "Luke?" He stepped forward, his eyes going to the child first. Without waiting for permission, he crossed the room, knelt beside the cot, and placed his hand on Emily's forehead. Then, quietly, "She needs a doctor, now." "There's no one in town who'll help us," Hannah whispered. "There's one 4 miles out. Dr. Taylor. He owes me." Before she could respond, Luke scooped Emily into his arms. Her small body looked even more fragile in his grasp. Hannah rushed after him as he walked into the storm. "Luke, get your coat," he said without turning around. She grabbed her shawl and followed him into the night. Luke's horse stood waiting, nostrils flared, eyes wide from the thunder. He mounted swiftly with Emily in his arms, then reached down and pulled Hannah up behind him. The rain lashed at them as they rode, hooves pounding through mud and water. The forest ahead dark and full of shadows. They rode for what felt like hours. Hannah held on tight, one arm wrapped around Luke, the other shielding Emily from the wind. Her daughter whimpered in her sleep, then fell silent again. They stopped once, beneath a large oak, its branches sheltering them slightly from the storm. Luke slid off the horse and carried Emily to the ground. He built a small fire with dry kindling kept in his saddlebag, hands moving with practiced speed despite the rain. Hannah sat beside them, her arms wrapped around herself, watching. Luke removed his coat, soaked through, and laid it over Emily. Then he shrugged off his heavier wool cloak and draped it around the child, his movements gentle, reverent. He stared at the flames for a long time, his eyes shining with more than just reflection. "She reminds me of someone," he said softly. "Mary, my wife. When she was sick, she had the same look, like she was fading right in front of me." Hannah's heart twisted. "She died in this kind of storm," he added, his voice barely audible. Hannah touched his hand. "I'm so sorry." He didn't pull away. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Emily stirred, murmured something unintelligible, and Luke leaned over her. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe now, little one." He looked at Hannah then, his eyes tired but full of something she couldn't name, something steady, something fierce. For the first time, she let herself see him not as a savior, not as a stranger, but as a man shaped by loss, like her. And yet, even now, she could not bring herself to believe that someone like him, strong, silent, kind, could feel anything more than pity for someone like her. Still, as the fire burned and the storm raged on, she allowed herself one quiet thought, buried deep in the folds of her heart. Maybe hope had a face, and maybe it wore a cowboy's hat. The morning air carried the soft chill of early spring, and the first buds were beginning to peek through the soil in the churchyard garden. Hannah stood near the steps of the chapel, her hands dusted with earth, her heart still unsteady from the whirlwind of the past week. Emily was better, truly better. The fever had broken, and with it so had something long buried inside Hannah. Fear, dread, the paralyzing weight of loneliness. Luke had not come to the church in days, but his silence had never meant absence. That afternoon, just as the sun began to slip toward the western hills, a shadow crossed the churchyard. Hannah looked up and saw him, Luke, standing near the gate, hat in hand, his eyes on her. "Can I borrow you for a moment?" he asked, voice rough, like wind over gravel. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, heart racing for reasons she dared not name. He didn't say where they were going, only walked slowly, leading her back to the old stable behind the church, the very place where she and Emily had first sought shelter, the place where she had hidden from shame, where she had whispered prayers into the darkness. Now, in the golden hush of late day, the stable was quiet, clean. Someone had cleared the hay, swept the floors. A small stool sat in the corner, a cloth laid neatly over it. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air. Luke turned to her, searching her face. "This is where you started, isn't it?" he asked. "The first night you came." She nodded, throat too tight for words. "I came here the next morning," he continued. "I saw where you slept, where your little girl curled up beside you, and I realized you never once asked anyone for more than you needed. You never expected kindness." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in soft fabric. "I don't have a ring," he said, his voice lower now, raw, "or flowers, or the kind of words most women might want." She watched, breath held, as he unwrapped the cloth and revealed the same silver-stitched handkerchief he had once given to Emily. The corner was still worn, the initials still gleaming faintly in the light. "I'm not a man who knows how to say things pretty," he went on, "but I know what I see. And I see a woman who's stronger than she knows, a mother who would walk through fire for her child, a heart that hasn't given up, even when no one else would lend a hand." He stepped closer and held the handkerchief out to her, not like a gift but like a vow. "I don't need perfect," he said. "I just need honest, real." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes before she could stop them. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she took the handkerchief in trembling fingers and pressed it to her lips, then to her chest. Luke opened his arms, unsure, hopeful, and she stepped into them without hesitation. The tears came hard then, the kind that broke something open. She buried her face against his chest, his coat still smelling faintly of leather and pine, his arms wrapped around her like a promise. For the first time in years, she did not feel alone. She did not feel afraid. She felt chosen. A small voice broke the moment. "Papa?" They both turned. Emily stood at the stable door, a ribbon falling from her hair, her eyes wide but smiling. Luke knelt and opened one arm. "Come here, little one." She ran to them, throwing herself into the embrace, her tiny arms around both their necks. And in that old, weathered stable, where once there had been only shadows, there was now something else, light, warmth, the fragile beginning of a family. Luke held them close, his voice thick as he whispered, "Home. That's all I ever wanted." And this time, Hannah believed it, truly, deeply, because for the first time, she felt it too. The sun dipped low behind the hills of Dusty Creek, bathing Walker Ranch in hues of gold and amber, The field beside the barn had been swept clean and bordered with wildflowers, simple daisies, lavender, and prairie blooms, plucked from the edge of the fields. Wooden benches lined the aisle, and an arch made from old wagon wheels and twine stood under the open sky. It was a wedding born not from wealth or grandeur, but from resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet rebuilding of two broken hearts. Hannah stood beneath the arch, her dress made by her own hands, cream linen with lace she had sewn along the sleeves. Her hair was gathered in a soft braid, with wildflowers tucked behind her ear. Emily stood beside her, barefoot in a sky-blue dress, holding a small bouquet nearly too big for her tiny arms. Luke waited at the end of the aisle, his coat freshly brushed, his boots polished, and that same quiet strength in his eye. He had never looked more himself. The townsfolk came, slowly at first, out of curiosity more than support. But over the weeks they had seen the change, how the ranch had come alive again, how Luke smiled more, how Hannah brought warmth wherever she went, and how Emily, sweet and bold, had charmed even the hardest faces. Old Mrs. Callahan from the general store leaned over to Hannah as she passed and whispered, "You remind me of my daughter. Brave and too good for this town." Hannah's eyes glistened as she nodded, her hand squeezing Emily's just a little tighter. Father Grant stood beneath the arch, his hands clasped around a worn Bible. His voice, though old, rang clear as he began the ceremony. "Love does not always arrive in neat packages. Sometimes it shows up with calloused hands and broken pasts, and asks simply to be seen, to be chosen." Luke took Hannah's hands in his. "I never believed I'd love again. I didn't think it was possible. But then you walked off that train, holding her hand like it was the only thing that mattered, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope." Hannah swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I came here with nothing, just a little girl and a heart too tired to dream, and now I stand here with everything, because you saw me. Not my past, not my flaws, just me." Father Grant smiled. "By the power entrusted to me, and under the great sky above us, I pronounce you husband and wife." Cheers and applause rippled through the crowd, but it was the soft sound of Emily's giggle that made the moment perfect. She skipped forward, tossing wildflower petals into the air, then ran into Luke's arms. He lifted her with ease and held her close. "Come here, my girl." Emily beamed. "I love you, Papa," Luke's voice caught. "And I love you, little one. My daughter." The crowd grew quiet, moved by the simple, powerful truth of those words. A family, not by blood, but by choice. Later they dined under string lights hung between fence posts, sharing pies and roast chicken, drinking sweet tea and laughter. Children chased each other through the fields, men tipped their hats to Hannah, women embraced her. The walls that once surrounded her had fallen away. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in brilliant orange and rose, Luke reached for Hannah's hand. "Walk with me," he asked. Together they strolled toward the wheat fields, Emily skipping ahead, arms outstretched like wings. The stalks rustled softly around them, golden and tall, bending gently in the wind. Luke looked at his wife, the woman who had once stood alone at a train station with nothing but courage in her eyes, and saw not a survivor, but a light. "I still don't have much to offer," he said softly. She smiled, leaning into him. "You gave me everything I never dared to ask for." Behind them, the ranch glowed in the twilight, filled with laughter, music, and the quiet knowledge that something new had taken root, not perfect, but real. And in the vastness of the land, with dust on their boots and love in their hearts, a man, a woman, and a little girl walked forward, not into the sunset, but into the rest of their lives. And so, beneath the open skies of Dusty Creek, a broken-hearted woman, a lonely cowboy, and a little girl with a bright spirit built something the world thought impossible, a family stitched together by grace, kindness, and second chances. It was not a fairy tale, but something better. A love story forged in quiet moments, in simple acts of care, and in the courage to begin again. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the beauty in resilience and the power of compassion, we invite you to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here, we share true and heartfelt tales that heal, inspire, and remind us all of the humanity we carry within. Subscribe now, because sometimes the stories that stir the soul are the ones we need most.